Evelyn Zumaya reads AffairsValentino.
I am Evelyn Zumaya, the author of AffairsValentino, and I want to read my book to you. Page 1. A prologue. The Vanishing Act. The French Riviera, Friday evening, August 20th, 1926. A few miles west of Nice, in the coastal village of Juan-le-Pin, the residents of the palatial Hudnut Chateau are preparing for the evening's séance. Gathering in a darkened room in the opulent manse are American cosmetics tycoon Richard Hudnut, his wife Muzzy, her daughter Natasha Rambova, and her friend from New York City, George Weiner. A dreary portrait of Russian spiritualist Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, hanging high above the fireplace, and one low wooden table are the room's only appointments. Helena Blavatsky's portrait is barely discernible in the pitch darkness, but the austere woman's eyes appear to gaze down upon the room named in her honor with an unsettling intensity. Designated solely for seances, the HPB room is sealed from the Mediterranean sunlight out of respect for the dearly departed. For without vigilant attention to the blinds and heavy draperies, the room would grant little sanctuary to any souls wandering about in their afterlife. The Hudnut family has just endured a harrowing week, after receiving a cablegram from New York the previous Monday, with news of Rudolph Valentino's sudden hospitalization. Natasha's high anxiety over her ex-husband's illness is no surprise to her mother. Muzzy remains convinced her daughter and Rudy are still deeply in love, despite their bitter divorce some 8 months earlier. With no telephone service at the Hudnut Chateau, Rudolph Valentino's closest friend and business manager George Ullman provided Natasha with updates on his condition throughout the week via frequent cablegrams from New York. Confident that Rudy was young and healthy, Natasha and her family responded by wiring their prayers and best wishes for his speedy recovery. On this Friday morning, the news from New York was heartening. George Ullman dutifully reported that Rudy was recuperating and even demanding he be allowed to smoke one of his black tobacco cigarettes. Relieved by this encouraging cablegram, the Hudnut household responded with breezy optimism throughout the afternoon. It was during this trying week that Natasha's friend George Weiner paid a visit to the Hudnut Chateau. Weiner was a man of many talents and claimed at various times in his career he'd worked as an actor, a musician, and a composer. But on this occasion he performs in one of his favorite roles by conducting seances as a psychic and medium. During each of his seances in the HPB room that week, his dear friend Natasha reverently awaited news via the spirits of Rudy's condition. Despite her unwavering faith in Weiner's psychic abilities, each of the week's seances ended with her tearful sobbing. On this Friday night, the good news from George Ullman has considerably calmed Natasha. As she enters the darkened HPB room, she nods silently to her mother, her stepfather, who she affectionately calls Uncle Dickie, and her doting medium George Weiner. She kneels at the low table and closes her eyes to summon the spirits for more encouraging news from Rudy's bedside, thousands of miles away. Beverly Hills, Friday morning, Pacific Standard Time, August 20th, 1926. High in the hills above the busy streets of Los Angeles, the morning sun dries any hint of moisture from the manicured gardens along Bella Drive. This particular morning is no different than any other day on the prestigious hilltop. The predictable sun, predictable heat, and predictable quiet are precisely why Rudolph Valentino makes this neighborhood his exclusive address. By most standards, his majestic, airy Falcon Lair is considered a modest residence, but like other homeowners in the neighborhood, he spared no expense in the purchase of as much shade from the California sun as possible. Because his estate is home to a menagerie of pedigreed pets, he thoughtfully provided more than the usual lavish landscaping as their comfortable shelter. Whenever Rudolph Valentino and his manager George Ullman are traveling, Falcon Lair is left in the care of the estate's handyman Luther H. Mahoney, nicknamed Lou. When these frequent occasions arise, Lou revels in his complete authority over the Bella Drive domain, for he despises taking orders, especially when they are issued by Mr. Valentino's manager, George Allman. When Lou is left in charge of Falcon Lair, the first order of his usual day is to check in with the groomsmen to ensure Mr. Valentino's dogs and horses are set for the day. On this Friday morning, Lou's trek from the main house down to the kennel is delayed by a few telephone calls. He first answers George Allman's regular morning call from New York to learn that Mr. Valentino is improving. Lou then answers a call from movie star Pola Negri's secretary, Florence Hine. Miss Hine's nagging curiosity about Rudy's condition annoys Lou, as he feels nothing but resentment and anger towards Pola Negri. Lou remains fiercely loyal to Natasha, and as far as he is concerned, Mr. Valentino's Polish mistress, Pola Negri, will always be an unwelcome guest at Falcon Lair. Nevertheless, he shares a few details from George Allman's optimistic report with Florence Hine. George Allman's morning telephone call lifts Lou's flagging spirits, and as he begins his routine inspection of the kennels, he is convinced Mr. Valentino will be home soon. The Irish wolfhound and the good-natured bulldog are Lou's particular favorites, and even the kennel's most recent arrival, a black water spaniel, appears to be adjusting to his new home. With his once-over of the kennels complete, Lou tromps back up the steep slope to check on the construction underway on Falcon Lair's driveway. He shrugs off the nagging memory of George Allman's final words to him before leaving on this last journey east with Mr. Valentino. Look for another job, Lou. But Lou has no intention of relinquishing his control over Falcon Lair. Any anxiety over his abrupt firing and impending dismissal does little more than sour his already prickly disposition. That Friday morning, 2 gardeners have just arrived at Falcon Lair with a delivery of several cypress trees. Lou has the men in a sweat in no time as he snaps his orders. I want these trees planted and watered before noon, he demands. I want 'em looking like they've been here for 20 years by the time Mr. Valentino gets home. Hollywood, Friday morning, Pacific Standard Time, August 20th, 1926. A few miles south of Falcon Lair, Florence Hine hurries across the famous Players Lasky's studio lot. It is only a brief walk to the sound stage where Pola Negri is filming that morning, but the secretary's quick steps can barely get her there fast enough. She is quite aware that Pola is furious at George Allman for not having called her all week, and can't wait to share the good news she just heard from Lou Mahoney. Florence is so beside herself with her fresh bulletin on Rudy that by the time she bursts onto the set of Pola's latest film, Hotel Imperial, she is nearly sprinting. When she spots Pola on the far side of the soundstage, she notices she is absorbed in a heated discussion with the film's director, Maurice Stiller. Florence begins waving frantically to grab her attention, but Pola eyes her secretary's flailing arm, flashes a disapproving glare her way, and returns to her argument with Stiller. Florence Hine has no other option but to park her prim self in a chair on the sidelines and wait. Yawning cameramen lean on their equipment. The blazing Klieg lights are switched off, and everyone sits tight as Pola Negri storms back and forth across the set, delivering a lengthy tirade in her heavy Polish accent. The issue is not resolved quickly, but eventually Pola winds down and filming resumes. While the cameras roll, Florence Hine sits patiently by until the troublesome scene is wrapped. It is an exasperating wait before she's finally able to give Pola every last detail of Lou Mahoney's reassuring news about Rudy. New York City, Friday noon Eastern Standard Time, August 20th, 1926. George Allman's wife Beatrice, who prefers to be called Bea, has just telephoned the Ambassador Hotel's room service, placing an order for lunch to be delivered to their suite. She looks forward to the meal and a few iced drinks as a sorely needed moment of calm before her husband returns to Rudy's bedside at the Polyclinic Hospital. George and B. Ullman are both physically spent from the past week's events, and New York's unrelenting heat wave is only adding to their distress. This welcome meal will be the first quiet time they have spent together in days. Before sitting down to eat, B places a telephone call to their children's nurse in Los Angeles to ensure that all is well with their 2 little boys. For one brief moment, life for B. Ullman seems to return to normal, and the horror of the past week appears to be over. Her husband, however, is not as relieved. Even the optimistic messages B wired that morning to Rudy's brother Alberto and ex-wife Natasha have not shaken George's profound anxiety over Rudy's condition. "Let me get this straight, B." George looks up from his lunch. "They said it would take 36 hours? B read the strain on her husband's face. "That's exactly what they said, George. The lab in Detroit couldn't possibly deliver Medifin here in New York for 36 hours. Dr. Rawls believes the only way a delivery could be made any sooner would be to send an airplane. Even then, there's no guarantee that the medication would have any effect on Rudy." George has to agree with his wife's assessment that treating Rudy with injections of Medifin was a desperate and dangerous measure. The mercury-based antiseptic was not readily available and was often toxic, even deadly, if used under the wrong circumstances. Even so, George is trying to negotiate a fast delivery. "Rudy's on the mend," B said. "Forget about the Medifin, George. It's too risky." Her calming voice has no effect upon her husband, and he is up from the table, pacing about the hotel suite. It gnaws at him. Why were the doctors not more relieved when their gravely ill patient appeared to rally? If Rudy's condition was still not a question of life and death, why did they continue to even discuss the use of Medifin? The several whirring electric fans strategically positioned around the hotel suite are having no effect on George, and he is sweating profusely. The robust 33-year-old, who was usually not so susceptible to the heat, turns to his wife. "I'm going back to the hospital." Juan Le Pen, Friday night, August 20th, 1926. George Wayner's dulcet voice fills the HPB room as he summons the spirits to guide him through the evening's murmurings. Natasha closes her eyes and takes comfort in the familiar ritual and her memories of the many seances she shared with Rudy over the past 4 years. Within a few minutes, Wayner's voice changes pitch, and he begins speaking directly to Natasha as Rudy's American Indian spirit guide, Blackfeather. In the guise of the ancient warrior, Wayner relates he is unable to speak with her for long because he cannot leave Rudy's bedside. Blackfeather's few words are followed by Wayner's delivery of a lengthier message from Rudy's other spirit guide, an Egyptian he calls Mesalope. As Mesalope, Wayner narrates an involved overview of Rudy's earthly life, which ends in the startling revelation that within the next few days, Rudy will pass on to a higher level of consciousness. His time on this earthly plane is complete. In light of George Ullman's positive cablegram that very day, Mesalope's ominous prediction makes no sense to Natasha. She is stricken by Wayner's words and rushes out of the HPB room and up the stairs to the bedroom sanctuary she once shared with Rudy. There she retreats for the remainder of the night with nothing to do but wait for another cheering cable from New York the following morning. With complete faith in Wayner's psychic abilities, Natasha feels she has little alternative but to prepare herself for the inevitably dire news. Not long after Natasha left the seance, her mother Muzzy checked in on her distraught daughter. She finds Natasha seated by her bedroom window, smoking a cigarette, her hair unbound from its signature coils and turban. Knowing she cannot coax Natasha from her seclusion, Muzzy makes no effort to do so. Instead, she leaves her anxious daughter alone to await the words she knows to be on their way. New York City, Sunday, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, August 22nd, 1926. Rudy's condition takes a grim turn for the worse on Sunday afternoon, and this makes it impossible for George to leave the hospital for very long. He knows Rudy sleeps soundly for at least an hour after each of his regular injections of morphine, and it is after one of these doses that George seizes the opportunity to rush to the Ambassador Hotel for a quick shower and shave. His wife Bee wastes no time trying to convince her exhausted husband to crawl into bed and sleep for a few hours. He dismisses her by saying he has only a few minutes to shower before Rudy wakes from his last morphine injection. Any relief George feels from his hurried shower is fleeting, and within a half an hour he's trudging again down the 8th floor hospital corridor and wiping sweat from his forehead. He finds Rudy still sleeping and gives the medical charts clipped to the foot of the bed a quick glance. George turns to the nurse on duty. "Call my wife at the Ambassador Hotel. Tell her to call Frank Manillo and have them both get over here right away." Within the hour, Bee and Rudy's godfather, Frank Manillo, arrive at the Polyclinic Hospital. With the imposing Italian businessman, Frank, now sharing the vigil at Rudy's bedside, George and Bee are able to sit in a nearby hospital office to dispatch more cablegrams. While Bee sits at a desk filling out the message forms, George takes a few steps across the room to gaze out a cheerless window at the city below. He is suddenly overwhelmed by a desire to be home in Los Angeles, in his den, playing his violin. For one moment it is not the middle of the night, and he is not listening to an office clock ticking away in Rudy's death chamber. For George, it is a peaceful Sunday afternoon, and he is a virtuoso, soaring through a Brahms concerto. "George, what about Alberto?" Bee pauses for her husband's direction. George sighs at the very mention of Rudy's brother Alberto. It is like sticking his hand into a flame to summon that man back in his direction. While Bee waits for his response, George grasps the awful irony of Alberto's recent departure from New York. He recalls the day only a few weeks earlier when he accompanied Rudy to the pier to see Alberto and his family off on their return trip home to Italy. George is absolutely certain of one thing at that moment. Alberto is as difficult as Rudy is handsome, and the brothers Valentino are like night and day, black and white. During Alberto's most recent visit to Falcon Lair, he and Rudy quarreled, sniped, and seldom agreed on anything. By the time they said their goodbyes at the ship's pier, George knew their sibling relationship had deteriorated to an all-time low. George stares out the 8th floor hospital window and watches the rank and file of Rudy's faithful fans on the streets below. He tries to shake his dread at Alberto's impending return, but with the clock ticking away, he turns to Bee. "Wire Alberto. Let's get it over with." Juan Lapin, Monday, 11:30 a.m., August 23rd, 1926. Breakfast preparations are well underway in the chateau's kitchen as the Hudnut chef busies himself with the final touches of another expertly executed meal. Outside, a gardener trims meticulously at the shrubbery's barely perceptible stray growth. High above his pruning, Muzzy stands before an oversized window, surveying her gardener's morning ritual. Despite the chateau's radiant formal gardens and the enticing aroma of the chef's breakfast emanating from the kitchen below, there is nothing beautiful about this morning. Muzzy is deeply concerned about her daughter, who has not eaten in 2 days and who has just refused another meal. Natasha was devastated by her psychic's message during the Friday night seance, and instead of waiting for George's cablegram the following day, she wired him on Saturday and again on Sunday, demanding more updates on Rudy's condition. She then resigned herself to the tedium of waiting for the next hand-delivered cablegram. When none arrived, her desperation set in. Furious at George for not having cabled her for 2 long days, there is little else she can do but chain smoke one cigarette after another and wonder just what was going on in Rudy's hospital room. Aboard the USS Homeric, Monday, 3 p.m., August 23rd, 1926. The White Star Line's ocean liner, the Homeric, steams across the Atlantic towards New York City. On the first day of the great ship's August crossing, Alberto Guglielmi Valentino sits on a deck chair smoking a cigarette. He was facing the specter of a third week at sea. He had just returned to Italy from New York when he received George Ullman's wire with news of his brother Rudolfo's sudden illness. George's last cablegram advised Alberto to return to New York at once because his brother had taken a turn for the worse. As Alberto once again plodded up the gangplank, he could scarcely believe that his younger brother could be so gravely ill. When he left him in New York only a few weeks earlier, he seemed to be in perfect health. Alberto suffered from seasickness, and he knew he would spend most of his time in oceanic transit feeling nauseous and weak. The thought of spending the next 10 days on another ocean voyage has him wallowing in a foul mood. 9 more days of this. This thought has him up from his deck chair and heading across the deck towards the cabin. Stumbling to keep his footing on the swaying ship, he flicks his cigarette out to sea and decides that he might just try sleeping all the way back to New York. Beverly Hills, Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, August 23rd, 1926. A few whiptail lizards skitter up onto the warming boulders near Falcon Lair's chain-link fence. On this morning, their sunbathing will be brief, as the most prized resident of Rudolph Valentino's kennel, the Doberman Pinscher K-Bar, is on the prowl. When the dog begins pawing on the metal fencing at the end of the run, the lizards zip off the rocks and back into hiding. The other dogs in the kennel pant to attention as K-Bar leaps up onto his muscular hind legs and slams the fence full force before dropping his weight back down to the dry earth. Looking up towards the main house, the great dog throws his head back and begins wailing up at the morning sun as if it were a full moon. K-Bar's howling echoes throughout the canyon below Bella Drive. Inside Falcon Lair, Lou Mahoney hears K-Bar's cries and reacts much the same as the other dogs in the kennel. The gruff handyman's heart skips a beat, and the hair on the back of his neck bristles. With no idea just what could be upsetting his boss's most cherished pet, Lou lumbers through the house and heads down to the kennel to investigate the mournful sound. Under ordinary circumstances, the persistent barking of Falcon Lair's dogs would have merited nothing more than a call down to the groomsmen in the stables. But K-Bar's distress demands urgent attention. Lou knows he is the only dog to ever travel with Mr. Valentino, and the only dog permitted inside the main house. Whenever Mr. Valentino is at home, K-Bar sleeps faithfully by his bedside in the master bedroom. Lou feels anxious as he hurries towards the kennels. He knows enough about dogs to recognize the cry of an animal in a sure state of agony. While Lou makes his way to the kennel, comedienne Beatrice Lilly is driving home and passing by the Valentino property on Bella Drive. When she hears K-Bar's howling, she becomes so distracted she loses control of her car, bounces off the narrow road, and lands in a ditch. As Beatrice Lilly assesses her predicament, back in the kennel, Lou is shouting commands at the frantic K-Bar. He knows Mr. Valentino trained the dog in Italian, but unfortunately, Italian is beyond Lou's understanding. So K-Bar registers no reaction to Lou's commands and continues to howl. It is as if the dog wants the world to know that Rudolph Valentino, his loving master, has just died in a hospital bed some 3,000 miles away. New York City, Monday, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, August 23rd, 1926. Within minutes of Rudolph Valentino's death, George Ullman delivers the news to reporters gathered in the hospital press room. He then returns quickly to the 8th floor of the Polyclinic Hospital to devote his full attention to the safe and swift removal of Rudy's body from the premises. He is acutely aware that crowds are pressing dangerously in on the hospital's every entrance, and he knows he cannot waste a second of precious time to react to his own profound loss. The shocking news is hitting the street hard, and George can hear the hell breaking loose. As the clamor of Rudy's fans in the street intensifies, the muggy air in the hospital corridors grows more stifling for George. As expected, his announcement of Rudy's death ignited the solemn encampments of fans outside the hospital into a full-scale riot. Reporters began sprinting over each other in a desperate effort to claim the front line. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, only a half an hour after Rudy's death, George has managed to avoid the fracas and is standing with his arm around his wife in a narrow hallway by the hospital morgue's side entrance. They stare in disbelief as two workmen struggle by them towards the door carrying a large wicker laundry hamper draped with heavy gold fabric. The workmen heft their load onto the back of a waiting truck, strategically parked in a back alley. Alongside this truck sits a New York City cab with the meter running. As the delivery truck pulls slowly out of the alley to head towards Campbell's funeral home on Broadway, Bea and George slide into the back seat of the taxi to make their own escape. As the cab speeds away, George glances back over his shoulder. The crowd swarming on the street in front of the hospital have no idea that Rudolph Valentino has just made his last successful getaway. Juan Le Pen, Monday evening, August 23rd, 1926. Natasha has fixated on the view from her bedroom for so long that at one point she actually thinks she sees Rudy on the manicured gardens below her window. There, on the court of palms, he's playfully teasing K-Bar by turning to hold a stick higher from the leaping dog's reach. The cablegram with the news of Rudy's death will not arrive at the Hudnut Chateau for another 24 hours. But on Monday evening, as Natasha's vision of the luminous dog and his master fades all too quickly, she realizes at that very moment that Rudy is gone. The North Atlantic, the USS Homeric, Monday evening. Alberto Guglielmi is sleeping so soundly that it takes the cabin boy a few minutes of furious pounding on his cabin door to rouse him. When Alberto finally does stumble to the door, he opens it with a gruff, "What do you want?" Sensing the man's irritation at his intrusion, the youngster shoves the cablegram in his hand, turns, and leaves. Alberto closes the cabin door and shuffles back to the narrow bed. Even though B. Ullman sent the wire in Italian, in his drowsy state, Alberto still struggles to comprehend the words. As the great ship dips into another rolling wave, he reads the cable once again and flips it onto the nightstand. "È morto, Rudolfo," he murmurs. "He's dead, he's dead." Beverly Hills, Monday, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, August 23rd, 1926. When K-Bar refuses to respond to Lou Mahoney's commands, the handyman throws his arms in the air and surrenders the stressful situation to the groomsmen. He then plods back up to the main house, where he enters to the sound of a ringing telephone. It is George, telephoning from New York. Lou listens for a few seconds and then sets the receiver back on the phone cradle without saying a word. K-Bar's plaintive howling grows louder, and Lou gives a shout down to the kennels for the groomsmen to bring the dog up to the house. As soon as Lou opens the door, the black Doberman streaks past him, running through the front hallway and towards the master bedroom. Lou follows the dog into Mr. Valentino's bedroom and locks the door behind him. As he sits his heavy frame onto the end of the bed, K-Bar is already wide-eyed and panting in his familiar position on the floor. Lou stares at the colorful room, which he always maintains in perfect order for Mr. Valentino's return. The bed's low, rounded blue enamel headboard glistens in the morning sun, and its gilded ball feet are freshly polished. The two orange enameled night tables flanking the headboard and the room's black satined overstuffed chairs were all cleaned that very morning. Lou catches himself in mid-gaze, rises from the mighty bed, and moves into action. There are, after all, a few important things demanding his immediate attention. His beefy hands swing open the two heavy closet doors, and he paws through the clothing inside until he finds exactly what he is looking for: Pola Negri's silk negligees. Lou hates how she spends night after night in Mr. Valentino's bed and despises the fact that she left such intimate items in this closet. He yanks the lacy nightgowns from their hangers and hurls them towards the bed. "Son of a bitch," Lou mumbles, "son of a bitch." At that moment, he resolves that no one will ever know that Pola Negri was sleeping with Mr. Valentino. With K-Bar panting in approval, Lou's chapped hands snag at more finery, and the pile of sensuous fabric on the bed grows. With Lou's raid on the closet complete, he then rummages through a few dresser drawers and flips the last of Pola's delicates onto the bed. He returns to the closet to grab a leather satchel embossed with the letters RVG, crams it full of the provocative evidence, and latches the case shut. New York City, Monday afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, August 23, 1926. While Rudy's body is en route to Campbell's funeral home, George and Bea manage a few minutes of privacy in their taxicab as it speeds towards the Ambassador Hotel. George dreads the impending confrontation with the army of press that will surely be waiting for him there and braces for the onslaught. As the cab turns down Park Avenue and wedges its way through traffic and oblivious pedestrians, George dabs his eyes with his handkerchief and adjusts his glasses. Just as he expects when the press outside the Ambassador Hotel see his cab pulling up to the curb, they surround the vehicle. George pays the cabbie, runs his hand over his hair, straightens his tie, and prepares to meet the press. Beverly Hills, Monday, 10:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, August 23, 1926. Lou hefts the satchel of Pola Negri's lingerie from the master bedroom to Falconlair's foyer and slides it across the polished floor towards the front door. He then turns his attention to a small doorway located behind a nearby flight of stairs. Removing a wad of keys from his pocket, he tries a few before he finds the key that swings the door wide open. He gropes in the musty hiding place until he locates a small tin box. With another rifle through his keys, he is able to snap the box's padlock open. Even in the darkness, Lou is relieved that the contents of the box are still safely inside. He ensures that Mr. Valentino's watches, rings, and cufflinks are all in order, clicks the lid shut, and steps out of the closet. In complete command, he places the small tin box of jewelry next to the leather satchel by the front door and continues his sweep of Falcon Lair. New York City, Monday afternoon, Eastern Standard Time, August 23, 1926. George paces back and forth in the sitting room of the Ambassador Hotel suite while engaged in a heated telephone conversation with Rudy's attorney in Los Angeles, W.I. Gilbert. "Find a will, damn it. I need to know what is required of me at this point." As the hotel's telephone connection crackles, George waits for the line to clear and turns to ask Bea. "Have the cables been sent to Alberto and Natasha?" "Yes," Bea replies, "and I just received one from Alberto with news that he's due here the 1st of September. George is only beginning to comprehend the magnitude of the day's horrific events. He has no doubt that as soon as Alberto arrives in New York, he will attempt to assume control over his brother's affairs. Alberto never held the slightest authority over Rudy's business affairs, but suddenly his position looms large for George. Bea pours her husband a shot of bourbon from his flask as he resumes his conversation with Attorney Gilbert. "Find a copy of the will, and as soon as you do, call me," George shouts. "Find it, God damn it." Beverly Hills, Monday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, August 23, 1926. With the conviction of an armed crusader, Lou moves in on Falcon Lair's office safe. He kneels before the lock, and after a few fumbles, the tumblers fall into place and the heavy metal door creaks open. Lou knows he's alone in the house, but still catches a quick glance over his shoulder. He rifles through the safe's jumble of loose papers and documents, and it is a few minutes before he finds what he's looking for. a 2-page document labeled The Last Will and Testament of Rudolph Valentino. He scans the first page of the will, then flips to the document's second page and pauses to read carefully. Lose single word, breaks the room's hallowed silence. Never. Thank you for listening, and my next installment will be Chapter 1, titled Skeletons in the Closet. I hope you will subscribe to this podcast so you will be notified when the next chapter goes online. As always, you may find a copy of AffairsValentino on Amazon and on all online book-selling venues.